So today we're going to be in Job chapter 19 most of the time, but we will flip back to a few other chapters. And what we're really going to do today is look at that response, Job's response. So chapter 19 is kind of a representative of Job's part in these ongoing debates between him and his friends. I did give you again that same outline from last week with that big picture outline of chapters, was it 4 through 26, that gives the 3 rounds of discussions and kind of the main point from each. But we're not going to go over that again because we did that last week. So let's look at chapter 19 itself. We start with chapter in verses 1 through 6. Job is going to directly rebuke his friends. So let's go ahead and read Job 19, 1 through 6. Then Job answered and said, "How long will you torment my soul and break me in pieces with words? These 10 times you have reproached me. You are not ashamed that you have wronged me. And if indeed I have erred, my error remains with me. And if indeed you exalt yourselves against me and plead my disgrace against me, know then that God has wronged me and has surrounded me with his net." So remember last week in verse 2, let's flip back a page, and we have something very similar in chapter 8, verse 2 as well, where Bildad says, how long till you put an end to words? And that's part of the big frustration that Bildad and some of the other guys are expressing, is that Job is just not listening. How long? And then he said it again back in chapter 8. Bildad says, how long will you speak these things and the words of your mouth be like a strong wind? That's 8 verse 2. So both 8 and 18 verses 2. Bildad opens up with this, how long are you going to keep saying stupid things? Well, Job's response is in verse 2 here. How long are you going to torment me? How long are you going to torment my soul and break me in pieces with words? And that's really that direct rejoinder against what we saw last week. In verse 3, we have this idea of 10 times you've reproached me. That 10 times is a figure of speech. We talked about those significant numbers before. We don't need to get into that again. But yeah, don't go back trying to figure out what are the 10 rebukes in the previous chapters. Just consider it a figure of speech where you keep doing this. Now let's look at verses 4 through 6. I think that's really, really important. He's saying, even if I've done wrong, and I'm not admitting I've done wrong because I don't think I've done anything wrong, but even if I've done wrong, he says, God's the one who's brought this about. Why are you guys acting as my accuser? Why are you all stepping into the role that doesn't really belong to you as rebuking me for all of this? What do y'all think of that? Is that a fair thing to say? Let's assume the friends are right and that there was some sort of sin. Are they wrong for telling him to repent? What do you think, Mickey?
No, I don't think so. I was just curious that the Old Testament characters didn't have any problem with God being the sender of bad things.
That's true. Yeah, they understood that bad things, God's the sender of good things and bad, right? That's a big theme in the Old Testament. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think Job acknowledges that good or bad, even evil, has to come to God before it takes place.
Yeah, they had a real good sense of God's sovereignty that sometimes we can kind of miss, and some of that's because we're trying to let God off the hook, which he's big enough. He doesn't need us to do that for him. He doesn't need us to let him off the hook. In our retreat, this men's retreat, Father Zach's first point was that we don't find God, he finds us. There are some people who would say, you know what, that sounds like you're saying that if God's doing everything, what are we doing anyway? Like it's there, like that idea of God's sovereignty can be so offensive to people because we want to be in charge. But what did Dial just say before class? Actually, that's a real big comfort knowing that God went and found me. Because it ain't about me, it's about him, right? Is there comfort in this idea that we see in Psalm 115 and in Job that even those bad things are coming from him? Like, is that good news as well? I don't know. What do you think, Mickey?
Father, I'm just going to ask you a question. Even evil would seem to have some good in that God's goodness is so great that it can even attach to evil and make it work out for good, according to Romans.
Yeah, and we see that illustrated really well in the story of Joseph, right? What y'all meant for evil, God's going to bring about good. So God can even use evil to bring about his goodness. Yeah, that's true.
And it's good to remember God doesn't like
Right.
He allows.
Yeah, so God permits the evil things. I mean, that's what we see in Job, right? Is that he lets Satan do these things. Doesn't make it himself, but he is in charge, and it is important to see, when it comes to the problem of evil, there's a lot of ways that philosophers and theologians, just regular folks, try to work that out. One of the ways that some people conclude, if they are just really hanging their hat so much on God's sovereignty, then that must mean, so they say, if God is sovereign and God's in charge, that must mean that God is the one that is the author of evil. That conclusion does not come from the premise, because you haven't first started to say, wait, what is evil to begin with? Augustine speaks about, and other people too, but he does a really good job of this. And oh gosh, I forget which of the books. I think it's in City of God. But Augustine goes on at length, and he really talks about evil as a perversion or a deprivation of good. It's like how darkness isn't a thing. Darkness is the absence of a thing, right? There is no such thing as darkness as a substance. And we would see evil the same way. It's a deprivation of good or a perversion of good, rather than a thing itself that had to be created. But let's go back to that first question. Is Job being fair, telling his friends, even if I've done wrong, you don't really have a right to rebuke me? This is between me and God. If he is being fair, why? Or if he's not being fair, why? We don't think there's any specifics on that. That's a good proper Anglican answer. Nice via media.
Is he really saying that they don't have right to present, or really saying that all these things that you're accusing of, I haven't done those things? So even if I have you haven't figured out what it is. You haven't pointed it out.
So maybe then the fairness is that you still haven't found anything that I've done wrong. So you keep accusing me, and there's nothing here. So this is okay. So that's and I think there's a lot to that. And the reason why I bring that up is because when we do have a friend that's getting caught up in wrong stuff, that doesn't mean it's just between them and God. Sometimes, as a Christian, we do need to be the one saying, hey man, you got to stop this. This is a bad road. And sometimes they will respond by saying, that's between me and God. You butt out of it. But I think that is different when that happens than what's going on with Job, because Job, he's like, I haven't done anything wrong. And he has not been convinced still.
And if I have done something wrong, you haven't helped me find out what it is.
Yeah, you haven't helped dig that up, even if I did.
It still remains.
Yeah. Okay, in verse 6, my translation, the beginning says, "Know then that God has wronged me." I think the ESV has "put me in the wrong." If you turn a few pages back to chapter 8, verse 3, there's a bit of a parallel going on here linguistically that might not be as clear in English. Verse 3, does God subvert judgment, or does the Almighty pervert justice? That word pervert in the end of verse 3 is the same word in the Hebrew that Job uses when he says that in verse 6, God has wronged me, or God has put me in the wrong. Is Job bringing an accusation against God's justice, do you think, here? Like, he's using the same word that Bildad used in the previous conversation, in his answer to Bildad in this conversation.
Is this about free will?
Not really. Yeah, the issue here isn't really about free will. I mean, because they're not debating whether or not the issue really is God being fair? That's the issue here. Is God being just? And go ahead, Dial.
I always, when I read the book of Job, and they go through all this stuff, I always figured, well, God given the devil an object lesson.
You think God's given the devil an object lesson? What's that object lesson? Yeah.
I think he is.
Yeah.
Okay, you do whatever you want, but you can't kill him. But you bring all these things that, but you cannot kill the man. And in the end, Job comes out further ahead than he was before.
Yeah.
So I think he was just showing him, okay, you can do all these terrible things, Job.
Yeah.
Just do whatever you want. But in the end, Job stayed true to his faith.
Yeah, Job never abandons God,
Never abandoned God. He questioned
but
God.
he does question God. That's right.
God.
Yeah.
Because, he's a human being and things are happening. But in the end,
And we are going to see that as we get into God's response in a couple weeks, that Job isn't completely off the hook. Like, Job does come out much better than his friends. But God has a few things to say to Job, too. And I think a lot of what God ends up having to say to Job is because of some of these types of things, like in verse 6. He says, if indeed, verse 5, if indeed you exalt yourselves against me and plead my cause, and plead my disgrace against me, know that God has wronged me. But God hasn't wronged you. Like, you don't see the big picture, Job, right? God did not pervert his justice. But Job doesn't see the big picture.
you're a human being. The things that happen.
Oh, yeah.
You've got to question, hey, why did you do this?
And I think part of what's happening in this big middle section of Job is that his friends actually made it a lot worse. Because his friends jump into the position of accusing. Who's the accuser in God's court? Satan. They're basically taking up the part of Satan in this. Accusing him when he doesn't have anything to be accused of. And as we saw last week, a lot of that is because they're working backwards from the effect to the cause. But correlation does not necessarily equal causation, and this is a really good example of this. So maybe the stuff where Job does kind of push the envelope a bit and gets a bit of a rebuke from it, maybe that wouldn't have happened if his friends had been better guys. But we also wouldn't have the book of Job. Let's let's move forward. Verses 7 through 12. Job is going to kind of elaborate on how he sees God attacking him. If I cry out concerning wrong, I am not heard. If I cry aloud, there's no justice. He has fenced up my way so that I cannot pass. He set his darkness in my paths. He has stripped me of my glory and taken the crown from my head. He breaks me down on every side. I am gone. My hope has he uprooted like a tree. He has also kindled his wrath against me, and he counts me as one of his enemies. His troops come together and build up their road against me. They encamp all around my tent. This is really more of the same. We don't need to dig into this, other than I would say that his suffering here is so big that he's like, it has to come from God. Like the only one that could do this that could do all of this stuff is God. Which again, I think is a really interesting observation, because it's almost, there's an apologetic here, right? All these things happen to me can't be a coincidence. You know, this has to be, God is saying something, doing something. I don't know what he says. What you guys are saying he says is not what he's saying. It can't be, because I haven't done anything, but this has to be from God. I also want to point out, we talked about this earlier as well, but back in verse 8, where we have, he fenced up my way, or he walled my way. That's more of that hedge language that we talked about back in chapters 1 and 2, when the devil says back in chapters 1 and 2, you've put a hedge around Job. And then Job says, he's hedged me in. Those same walls that can be a fortress can be a prison. And so we have that theme popping up again, only pointing it out, you know, in terms of that's some of the way that poetry of this all works, is these themes pop up again. Yeah, just pointing that out. Let's get to the next part a little bit, verses 13 through 19. He has removed me, and we're going to be seeing Job's social isolation here. He's removed my brothers far from me, and my acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My relatives have failed. My close friends have forgotten me. Those who dwell in my house and my maidservants count me as a stranger. I am an alien in their sight. I call my servant, but he gives no answer. I beg him with my mouth. My breath is offensive to my wife. None of us can say that sometimes. And I am repulsive to the children of my own body. Even young children despise me. I arise and they speak against me. All my close friends abhor me, and those whom I have loved turned against me. And what do we see in the in those first couple chapters? You know, God actually takes away his family and a lot of his servants. I mean, most of his servants are like, I was the only one that made it out alive. And you know what? Given their worldview, I bet you those servants are saying, I wonder what the boss has done to bring this on himself. Like they're probably thinking in the same terms as the friends. You know, and his wife, you should just curse God and die, right? So even that part about my breath is offensive to my wife. That's yeah. I mean, God took it all away, and that's what it seems to Job anyway. And that's an important part too, because remember, Satan says, well, if he has his health, everything's fine. You know, let me attack his health, and then he'll curse you. But that other stuff, that social part's huge too. You know, it is bad to be isolated, and that's what Job's complaining about here. But notice those parallel to the script descriptions in chapters 1 and 2. We're running out of time, so I'm going to push through a little bit. We'll have a little bit more discussion for the very end of this chapter. Verses 20 through 22, his cry for mercy. My bone clings to my skin and to my flesh. I've escaped by the skin of my teeth. That's where we get that expression, by the way. That's a common idiom. We get that from the Bible. Have pity on me, oh you my friends. For the hand of God has struck me. Why do you persecute me as God does and are not satisfied with my flesh? Remember for that last thing, what Satan said. Oh yeah, skin for skin. You know, and that's kind of coming back. You're not satisfied with my skin, not satisfied with my flesh. And Job's friends, they say, you guys owe me better than this. You guys owe me better than this. I'm basically dead, and you're not even merciful as I'm dying here. Okay, then let's get to the real heart. I hate that we have 10 minutes for the real heart of this. Verses 23 through 27. This is the real important part. Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book, that they were engraved on a rock with an iron pen and lead forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. After my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold and not another. How my heart yearns within me. If you should say, how shall we persecute him, since the root of the matter is found in me? Oh, I'm sorry. Should have stopped at verse 27. Whom I shall see for myself, my eyes shall behold not another. How my heart yearns within me. Let's stop there. So here's the passages that our burial service grabs a lot from. I know that my Redeemer liveth. He shall stand at the last on the earth. After my skin is destroyed, this I know, in my flesh I shall see God. So, yes, he's complaining against God earlier. But in the end, he's like, but actually, I know better than that. Which goes to Dial's point, and unfortunately, he had to go off the choir. But, yeah. What do y'all think? Do you think this is expressing an Old Testament belief in the resurrection of the body? Do you see this as Job's thinking about those messianic promises? Or does this seem more like, hey, Job just kind of stumbled upon one of those truths that we don't really get to see the fruit of until the New Testament? What do y'all think?
Well, it's good to see the whole context. It's coming across to me that he's kind of thinking through all of this.
Yeah.
And he's coming to this positive conclusion, I would say.
Yeah, he is. He's thinking it through. He's reasoning it through. Yeah.
Coming out of it a little bit.
Yeah.
As Donald Rumsfeld would say, he's discovered the unknown unknown.
He's discovered the unknown unknown. That's nice. That's good, Bob. I think so. He stumbled upon something there. He's gotten better. What else?
He's had a focus shift.
The focus is
From
shift.
his problems in his flesh to, God and what the reality there is.
Yeah, he moved his eyes from himself to God. That's an important thing in suffering. We acknowledge our suffering, but we need to keep our eyes on the only one who really is in charge of it all. Yeah. Yeah, this is a real cool bit.
I guess it didn't mean that's what I would do, involved in something that's difficult, a trial, and I'll work through my go from playing to God, and then if I keep going through it, I get to the point, well, here's God, here's some control. I had some questions.
And we see a similar pattern. I mean, we're going to get that for our next book, because we are going to slowly move our way through the wisdom books. But when we get to the Psalms, we see the same thing happens a lot with the laments. They do complain. They're very honest with what they're feeling. They're very honest with what they're going through. Sometimes they even push back and question God. But I think with only one exception in all 150 Psalms, by the end of the Psalm, they are praising God. Because what is that? Well, we return to our anchor. We return to the foundation. Father Zach talked about integrity as being that superstructure that keeps the plane from falling apart under stress. Here's Job's integrity. I know that my Redeemer liveth. Yeah, okay. Let's look at the very last two verses, because this is something that Bildad and Zophar and the other guy need to hear. If you should say, how shall we persecute him, since the root of the matter is found in me, be afraid of the sword for yourselves. For wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment. He's saying, it basically goes back to, you guys are not dealing with me fairly. And you keep talking about, well, this bad stuff must be because God did something. You're doing bad. And so this judgment you're bringing on me, that's going to come back on you, because you're perverting judgment in all of your accusations. Watch out, guys. And what do we find out? That's actually true when we get to the end of the book. That but God doesn't leave them there, but he does. There's some irony in the way he kind of handles all that.
Job and Ecclesiastes kind of have the same particular quality in that both of them give you something at the very end of the book that informs how you should have been reading. Like Ecclesiastes, here's the end of the matter. End of Job, God said, hey, these friends are not in the right. You can't trust everything that is not speaking.
Yeah, that is important. Which is probably one of the areas where, when they assign Job in that freshman literature class or whatever class they do, some humanities class, it's a bit unfair, because a lot of those people in there have never read Job. They haven't read the introduction in the ESV Study Bible or whatever, and so they don't get to the end until they get to the end. We know the end, so we can kind of look back and filter what Job's friends are saying through that. Same thing with Ecclesiastes. When we know the end, we can filter some of that other stuff through that. And I don't know if y'all have ever, there's a book series where that I really like. And in one of the more recent ones, the author did something he doesn't usually do, just threw a total twist ending, that's not unusual. But you find out something in that twist that informs the way you look at everything else. And whenever I reread that, I'm like, okay, I got to keep that in mind. But I always forget what the key was to the twist. Like, I know the end, but so it's never fully satisfying. But it is interesting how these are meant to be reread. They are meant for us to really get our wisdom when we know the big story and revisit it. Yeah.
The value in processing it, not just in people.
Yeah, that is a big part of the wisdom literature, is ruminating the process. And just for kind of off topic but similar, I'm listening to kind of a collection of some of what C.S. Lewis wrote about reading. He was a huge reader, but one of the things that he said is, a mark of someone that's really a reader, not just someone that reads, but someone who is a reader, is that you enjoy revisiting those things. If you just, okay, I've read it once and then I'm just going to dump it, that's not really what the joy of reading comes from. You're missing out on a lot. And I think that's more than any other book, the Bible, that's true for the Bible. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end there. It is 11 o'clock. Next week, we may look at, I've been thinking about this for almost a week now and I don't have an answer. We may look at one of the chapters in Job's big kind of closing arguments. Or we may skip straight to Elihu's interjection. Look at any of that, even if it's just in a summary fashion, and we'll do one of those next week. God bless y'all.